I don't know about you guys, but I want to take this thing down. I want to win Best Ball Mania 4, and this today will be the ultimate guide for conquering Best Ball Mania 4. Everything from roster construction to, values on ADP to strategy to stacking, all that stuff will be covered in today's video. I'm going to talk about the proper way to implement each strategy and the ultimate big takeaway at the end of the video. So make sure you stick around to the end. Leave any comments down below. Leave a like on this video if you enjoyed, and subscribe to the channel if you are new around here. But let's not waste any time. Let's get right into it. All right, off the top, first, let's get into the basics of Best Ball. If you guys are new to it, of course, be sure to sign up on Underdog Fantasy using promo code FSE, and they will match your first deposit up to $100. But Best Ball is what it sounds. You draft a fantasy football team, and it plays your best lineup. There is no in-season management. There is no waivers. There is no trades. You draft, and the software automatically will play your highest point lineup every single week. So not only is it a great way to win some big prizes in Best Ball Mania 4, it's also better practice for your home redraft league. If you guys play in a league with your buddies, your college buddies, your work buddies, your family, whatever, this is way better practice for you than simply doing mock drafts on Sleeper, because Underdog ADP is real money drafts with sharp players who are, grinding strategy and that kind of thing. So you're not going to get any cupcake teams like you do when you do a Sleeper mock draft against the CPU, for example. So Best Ball Mania 4 is the big contest on Underdog Fantasy. It's a $15 million prize pool. There's $3 million to first place. $10 million goes to the tournament style at the end of the season, and $5 million uniquely this season is a separate prize pool for regular season points. So drafting, high-scoring teams and advancing as many teams as possible is more important than ever, because there's a $5 million separate prize pool for the regular season. So the tournament structure is as follows. There is a 14-week regular season. So from weeks 1 through weeks 14 of the NFL regular season, 2 members of your 12-man draft league. So when you do one of these drafts, you're in a 12-man league. 2 of those guys will advance to the next round. If you advance past the weeks 1 to 14 area, you get into week 15. And in week 15, there is a 16-man league that you have to win to advance to week 16. If you win in week 15 and advance to week 16, then you have to win another 16-man league in week 16 to advance to the all-important week 17 final, where 441 people will compete for $3 million to first place, $1 million to second. Most of the money in this tournament is at the top there. So let's talk some strategy. Let's talk about how you can win this thing, take this thing down, because that's what I am trying to do. I'm sure you guys are trying to do that as well, or at least be profitable if you intend to do a bunch of entries. There's 150 max that you can do. I intend to make all 150 count, or if you're just doing, 25 of yours, make sure you want to make all of those count as well. So the first tip in Best Ball that I'm going to hammer home, it is the most important thing of all of the tips that I'm going to talk about, is to optimize roster construction. Roster construction, no matter what players you're actually drafting, is easily the most important factor in Best Ball. So many teams are tanked just because they built their team suboptimally. And by suboptimally, I'll get into what that means by position. The other thing that you need to keep in mind, though, is trying to advance as many teams as possible. For starters, that gives you more bullets in the chamber to potentially win this entire thing, or at least advance teams to week 15 and week 16. And also, there is a ton more regular season prizes this year, so you want to have the highest scoring possible teams that you can to get shares of those regular season prizes. There is 18 spots on your roster in Best Ball Mania 4. Each week, you have to start 1 quarterback, 2 running backs, 3 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and a flex in a half PPR format. Josh Lee from the Undroppables put out a great thread about Best Ball Mania 4 strategy that I'll be referencing here and throughout this video, including the chart that I'm about to break down. So he calculated playoff advance rate by roster construction in Best Ball Mania 3. So last year's contest, the average advance rate, the average expectation is that 2 out of 12 teams will advance, because that is the tournament structure. And the teams that yielded a better than average advance rate are the top 5 teams that you guys can see there. And the roster constructions are quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends. So that 2-6-7-3 that was the most profitable was 2 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 7 wide receivers, 3 tight ends. Then 2-6-8-2, 2583, 2574, and 3573. So last year, it was optimal to have 2 quarterbacks most of the time. Sometimes you could have 3 quarterbacks, but almost never was it optimal to have 1 quarterback, and almost never was it optimal to have 4 quarterbacks. So 2 to 3 is the sweet spot, depending on where you're spending in the draft. Again, if you draft a great quarterback like Josh Allen, you probably only need 2, and vice versa. If you fade quarterback, you probably need 3. It was optimal to have between 5 and 6 running backs most of the time. All 5 of the top 5 advanced rate constructions that I just outlined had either 5 or 6 running backs. So typically that is the range that you want to stay in. But of course, if you get great values early on in the draft and you want to go with a 4 running back build, or you completely punt running back, you want to go with a 7 running back build, it's definitely viable, but 5 or 6 is typically best. At wide receiver, it was mostly optimal to have 7 or 8 wide receivers, since you have to start 3 of them every week, and running backs are easier to find late. In my experience, it makes sense to have more wide receivers and prioritize them earlier on in your drafts. The most surprising thing of this, chart was that more than 2 tight ends performed extremely well. 7 of the top 10 and 4 of the top 5 had more than 2 tight ends. So they either had 3 tight ends or they had 4 tight ends. I think sometimes people often forget that you need to start a tight end every week. And if you don't have Travis Kelce, if you don't have one of these top guys, it is very difficult to find consistent tight end production. And if you're putting up, 2 points or 1 point or whatever a week in your tight end spot, that's definitely going to hinder the performance of your entire lineup. So having multiple good tight ends is also still beneficial to you. So even if you draft 3 tight ends and you only probably needed to draft 2, they can work into your flex. So I wouldn't worry too much about drafting 3 tight ends being, suboptimal because you're over investing in that position. This is something that I've personally put into practice this best ball season, and I think you guys definitely should as well. So unless you get 2 tight ends where one is Travis Kelce and one's like a top 15 tight end in ADP, you should probably draft 3 tight ends overall. The strategy that I've been implementing mostly is that I want to get either 2 top 15 tight ends, or I want to get 3 tight ends overall and get some late round dart throws. So in my opinion, the first tip here that we're talking about, the answer to the question, what is the best roster construction to help increase your chances of winning this contest or being profitable in this contest, is spend 5 picks on tight end and quarterback, depending on which one you spent up on. The remaining 13 of your 18 picks, you should spend on wide receivers and running backs. Again, depending on what you spent up on. Usually I'm doing mostly 3 tight end builds because I'm spending up at quarterback and getting 2 top 15 type of quarterbacks. I'm usually taking 5 to 6 running backs, 7 to 8 wide receivers. So for me, the most common build will probably be 2, 5, 8, 3, or it will be 2, 6, 7, 3 most of the time. So those are the builds that I'm going to be personally implementing. Tip number 2 is drafting as if you're right on your player takes. So what this basically means is all of us have takes, right? I like certain players. You like certain players. I love CeeDee Lamb this year. I love Bijan Robinson this year, etc. You're going to like players that I don't like, for example. The key to being profitable in these drafts is making yourself right multiple times. And if that sounds confusing, this is what that means. An example of this is, let's say I take Bijan Robinson at 5th overall in one of my drafts. I draft him over Cooper Kupp, who maybe is going ahead of him in overall ADP. I'm inherently making the bet that both Bijan Robinson will be great and that Cooper Kupp maybe have a disappointing season because I passed on him for Bijan Robinson. So to make sure that that micro player take that I just made by making that selection benefits me the most it possibly can, if that indeed plays out in the actual NFL season, I'd want to avoid drafting Matthew Stafford, because chances are if Stafford is great, then Cooper Kupp probably was too. I'd probably want to avoid drafting Tyler Algier, because he is Bijan's handcuff. And if Bijan Robinson is phenomenal and the RB1 overall this year, and that's the bet that I'm making by taking him that high, I'm betting on health for Bijan Robinson. So I don't want to draft Tyler Algier in that case. And maybe because I passed on Cooper Kupp for Bijan Robinson, maybe I want to select Van Jefferson later on in my draft because for whatever reason I think Cooper Kupp is going to get hurt and Van Jefferson will get fed volume in his absence. That's just one example, but that's basically how you can use making one decision and turning it into multiple decisions and making yourself really, really right if it ends up working out. Because if Bijan obviously was a much better pick than Cooper Kupp, not only is that going to increase the win rate of my team, it's going to decrease the win rate of Cooper Kupp teams. And if I make myself right multiple times, it's going to help me out in the rest of my roster. So that is tip number 2. Tip number 3 is stacking. And the caveat that I'm going to put on stacking is stacking only when it makes sense and only when it's possible. So stacking is where we're going to get into the weeds a little bit in this video. So let me just start with this. Stacking is another example of what I just talked about, where you're drafting to make yourself right. Ergo, if you draft Jamar Chase, you make yourself right twice by then drafting Joe Burrow, because if Jamar Chase is great, then Joe Burrow is probably going to be good as well. So that is an example of tip number 2. However, this is not a new concept. Everybody on Underdog is stacking. Everybody knows that it's important. The entire field on Underdog Fantasy is sharp, and they already do this. So it is not a massive, massive advantage to stack. It's like juicing and wrestling. Every pro wrestler is on steroids, so it doesn't really give you an advantage to also then be on steroids, but you probably should be on steroids. You should be stacking your team. You should be building out team stacks, mini stacks, multi-stacks, whatever. And this chart is a perfect example. You guys can see playoff advance rate by team stacks. And again, this is from Josh's thread over on Twitter. When you had, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 team stacks on your team, it increased your win rate or your playoff advance rate a little bit, but it didn't increase it by more than 1.2%. So yeah, it was beneficial to stack, and it can increase your odds, because not stacking at all is not good, and stacking too much is not good, but it's not going to be this inherent edge that pushes your team over the top, because everybody is already doing it. So for example, if you think the Pittsburgh Steelers are undervalued and you want to stack up Deontay Johnson and Pat Freiermuth because the passing game you think is going to be better than most people think, that's something that you should do. And that's something that you're going to make that bet, and you're going to increase your odds of that bet hitting if the Steelers passing offense takes a big step forward this year. But what you shouldn't do is take Gabe Davis over Jordan Addison, for example. For me, Jordan Addison projects way better. If you prefer Addison, you should not take Gabe Davis just because you drafted Josh Allen, for example. It is a tiebreaker to stack. It is not a tier breaker to stack. You still want to draft the best players on the board, regardless of if it improves your stack or if it improves your correlation whatsoever. Drafting the best players is consistently the best strategy, and you're going to kick yourself for forcing a stack and passing on a superstar upside type of piece. So tip number 4 of this video is knowing the best times to draft. And this one's like sneakily important, because if you intend to max enter this tournament, or you intend to do a lot of entries, maybe you're going to do 30 entries, maybe you're going to do 50 entries, maybe you're going to do all 150 like I'm going to do. It's definitely fun to be doing drafts right now, but I will say the best strategy that you guys can employ is to make sure that you don't have a bunch of dead teams. And if you draft, let's say 95 or 100 of your 150 entries in May and June, and a bunch of the players that you draft blow out their knee in training camp or whatever, you're going to have a bunch of dead teams. So Josh, in his thread, found literally zero correlation between your team getting great value on players versus advance rates in the playoffs. So you might be thinking the other side of that coin is if you draft in May and June, you might get some good values on like rookie running backs. You might get some good values on, this player is going in round 4 in August, but round 9 in May. And while those scenarios exist for sure, you're probably going to have just as many teams that had a player go down with injury, or his outlook changed because they signed a new running back, and, really that hurts the overall projection of your team. So it definitely can be an edge to draft in May, in June, when the ADP is not fully settled in yet. But trust me, for every one time that happens, you'll have like 2 or 3 teams with a dead player on it. And this chart from Mike Leone over at Establish the Run is a good example of this. So as you guys can see, May, June, and July yielded a lot of teams with not that many live players on them. There was a lot of teams that only had 13, 14, 15, 16 live players because players went to IR, they got injured. So while 10% of the overall teams in Best Ball Mania 3 were drafted in May, only 5% of the playoff teams were drafted in May, because a lot of these teams didn't finish particularly highly because, they had a bunch of players that were injured and it impacted their total points. So the moral of the story is I would save the majority of your entries for August, when we know what the depth charts are looking like, when we know which rookie is outperforming their current status, when we know who got injured in training camp, when we know who got injured in the preseason, who looks like a worse bet now than they did in May or June. Since I'm in Ontario, I have to travel to do my drafts, and the way I'm spreading it out is I did 30 entries already in May, I'm doing 40 in July, and then I'm going to do the remaining 80 of them in August. So I'm going to backload most of my drafts for August, for September, when we have the most information. Although having a $5 million prize pool for the regular season does kind of incentivize you to get some good values on players now, I would rather aim for the big prizes. I would rather make sure that I don't have a bunch of dead players in week 17 when all the money is at the top. So Tip number 5, and then we're going to close this video out, is correlating your Week 17 matchups. So you guys may have heard this term before. I'm sure if you're in the best ball streets, you probably know what this means. Basically, what this means is that we know that the Chiefs and Bengals are playing in Week 17 this year. Week 17 is that 441 player tournament that you need to advance to win the $3 million. Ergo, people are stacking up Chiefs-Bengals, or they're stacking up Saints-Buccaneers, or they're stacking up whatever, Jaguars-Panthers, whatever team stack that they have, they're stacking them up with their Week 17 opponent, because from a DFS perspective, this makes sense. If that game shoots out, there's probably going to be a lot of performances in that game that have high fantasy points. So put simply, this is where all the money is, right? People stack up Week 17 because if you're fortunate enough to get to Week 17, you want to have a chance to win the $3 million. And at the top, if you want to win the $3 million, you have to be right about less things if your team is correlated in Week 17. Ergo, Daily Rojo, a.k.a. Pat Kerrane, his team that won last year, won $2 million because he was correlated. Tom Brady, Chris Godwin, and DJ Moore, the Panthers and Buccaneers played each other in Week 17. Tom Brady had a monster game. Chris Godwin caught a lot of passes. DJ Moore caught some touchdowns, and that game was very profitable for Pat Kerrane. And you might be looking at his lineup and thinking, wow, this lineup won $2 million last year. He obviously picked some good players like, Austin Eckler had a good season, Barkley had a good season, Ramondre had a good season, DJ Moore, Jalen Waddle, Tua Tagovailoa, Tyler Lockett, and George Kittle. But the reality of the situation is he pretty much got lucky. And when you get lucky, you want to make sure you're getting really lucky. Hence why, him getting lucky with Tom Brady having a great performance, even though he was pretty much ass all year, means that, DJ Moore had to score up points on the other side of the ball. He didn't even have Mike Evans in this lineup, and Mike Evans caught all 3 of Tom Brady's touchdown passes in that game. And remember, if there's only 400 people competing in this final thing, you don't need to have the perfect lineup. You just need to have your thing go well in case a couple things that you're predicting go your way. And Best Ball Mania 2 winner, Chess Liam, also had a naked Jamar Chase go off in Week 17 of 2022, or of 2021. He had a correlated Amon-Ra St. Brown and Rashad Penny go off in the same game. So that was the Week 17 correlation that he had, which was Lions and Seahawks. They played each other, and Penny had a big game on one side of the ball, and Amon-Ra St. Brown had a big game on the other side of the ball. So these strategies are all important. Week 17 correlations and all that good stuff. Definitely try and get unique with them, right? Like if you're going to stack, don't stack the prototype. Every single team is going to have this stack. Don't, correlate the exact same players. Every single, team that stacks up Chiefs Bengals is going to have Travis Kelce and Jamar Chase, or Travis Kelce and, Sky Moore, Kadarius Toney, whatever the case is. You want to try and get as unique as possible with these things. And all of these rules and strategies are important. But the bottom line is, as I've said throughout this video, is it realistically all comes down to luck, because in Week 15, in Week 16, and Week 17, it's essentially 3 separate DFS contests that you have to win the $3 million. So the key is to position yourself so that you can get really lucky if you get lucky. So for me, what I'm doing with my teams is I'm trying to advance as many teams as I can. I'm trying to get as many teams into the dance, into Week 15 as I possibly can, because that increases my chances of making it to Week 17, and that increases my chances of winning the $3 million. So these are 2 teams that I have drafted so far. And the first team that you guys can see on the screen is a 3-5-7-3. So 3 quarterbacks, 5 running backs, 7 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. Didn't really spend highly at quarterback or at tight end, hence why I went with 3 of each of those positions. I got some stacks in there, right? I got Mike Williams and Austin Eckler. I have Calvin Ridley. I have Trevor Lawrence. I have Bryce Young and Hayden Hurst. I have Jonathan Taylor and Josh Downs. And I also have some Week 17 correlation in there, because Jonathan Taylor and Josh Downs on the Colts, they play against the Raiders in Week 17, Jimmy Garoppolo and Hunter Renfrow. If that game shoots out, it's possible that those guys go off. My Jaguars and my Panthers stack, Ridley, Lawrence, Bryce Young, and Hayden Hurst, they play each other in Week 17 as well. Same goes for Brandon Ayuk and Antonio Gibson. The 49ers and the Commanders play each other in Week 17. I think you guys probably get the picture, but I'll show you guys one more team to give you another example. 2-6-7-3 is this build. 2 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 7 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. I did an onslaught of Cleveland Browns, so in this draft, I'm, again, trying to make myself really right if I am right by drafting Amari Cooper, by drafting Deshaun Watson. I'm assuming that the Browns offense takes a big step forward. Ergo, I also draft Elijah Moore and David Njoku to give me some more spike weeks from that team. Brock Purdy and Deebo Samuel, I also stacked those 2 guys together. Deebo Samuel and Antonio Gibson play each other in Week 17, so I got some correlation there. And then Jonathan Taylor and Devontae Adams play each other in Week 17, so I got some correlation there. So ultimately, the best way to win this contest is to draft the best players, and that should go without saying. So keep these strategies in mind, but don't go overboard to the point that you're fading better players to get your stacks or to meet a week 17 correlation or to meet certain roster constructions that you have in mind. And of course, if you enjoyed this video, if you got some value from it, definitely leave a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new. If you want to know exactly which players we're targeting this summer in these drafts, be sure to stick around and watch all of our videos this summer. And if you want to get a piece of action yourself, if you want a chance to take down this behemoth, I know I have a lot of things that I could spend $3 million on. I'm sure you guys could as well. BBM4 is the biggest contest in fantasy football in best ball. Underdog Fantasy also has the Chihuahua going. They're also going to have puppy drafts live, which are like $4 and $5 entry drafts. So you don't need to enter the big kahuna to get some stake into the action. And like I said, this is also the best way that you can get practice for your home redraft league to make sure that you are prepared to go up against your league buddies and kick the shit out of them in your home redraft league that I'm sure you guys care as much about yours as I care about mine. And as I mentioned earlier, using the promo code FSE at sign up and first deposit on Underdog Fantasy will match your first deposit up to $100. So if you put in $50, you'll get an additional $50 on the site for using our promo code. And also, anybody that uses our promo code this summer will get our best ball rankings for free and our redraft rankings for free once those are officially live. That'll probably be coming in the month of July, and we will send out emails to anybody who has used our promo code. So definitely appreciate all the support on the channel. But with that being said, peace out, and we'll talk to you soon.